A nuclear bomb. How does that feel? Destruction. A blinding light. A shockwave shivering all over your body. But what do we know about this? For this, we have to ask a survivor. And there is one. This is Tsutomu Yamaguchi. And he survived the 2 nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. What suffering his generation must have endured during the times of Japanese aggression in Asia and the Pacific. Welcome, everybody. This talk will be about the difference in war memory between Germany and Japan. A person who looked at this from quite a different perspective than Yamaguchi is this. This is Emperor Hirohito. None of the Japanese has ever heard his voice during the war. Instead, what they saw was this iconic picture of a man sitting on a white Mustang. A picture that could have become the emblem of destruction and war for the people in Asia and Japan alike. Me being a German, I'm often asked about why, deservedly or not, Germany seems to have apologized, while Japan is frequently accused to not have done so. For me, this is not a value judgment. It is more about finding some fundamental causes and roots of why one country is perceived differently than the other, even though on paper both apologized. Germany can probably be seen to have apologized when Willy Brandt knelt down in Warsaw. He knelt down in front of the graves of 6 million Jews. 6 million Jews that were killed by Hitler. 6 million Jews that were killed by machine men with machine hearts and machine minds, as Charlie Chaplin would have said. The life of a Jew was literally just worth the teeth in his mouth or the coins in his pocket. Some Jewish lives less in Nazi Reich. So, kneeling down was probably the right choice to say sorry. Even though it was spontaneous, and back in Germany, many did not agree. Many just did not feel this way. Many did not say, that's good. This would take another 20 years to form a more comprehensive sense of responsibility and guilt to evolve in the late 1980s. And it was around at this time, in the early 1990s in Japan too, that a more comprehensive discourse about the war emerged in Japan. In this time, we see, for example, the Murayama statement. But still, why is it that one country is acting in such a symbolic way, while the other is more having a formal apology? To understand this, we have to go back several decades in time and see around the post-war years and how Yamaguchi experienced them. Looking back at history, every nation does so with different feelings depending on its fate. For Korea, it was a time of great liberation. For Japan, it was one of demilitarization by an occupying force. And I suggest that it is in this time that we can see the roots of why history is perceived differently in Japan and in Germany. Simply speaking, in Germany, the US forced the Germans to denazify and see and witness the destruction they brought upon others. In Japan, the US allowed the Japanese to retreat and develop a sense of victimized nation themselves. That both would be treated differently was clear from the beginning. In the occupation eyes, the Germans were not to be trusted. All Nazi institutions had to be removed. All people in there had to be removed. Instead, the US built something new, something more democratic. They were clear about this from the outside when they said the Germans cannot escape responsibility. In Japan, however, the US somehow trusted the Japanese. Here, we see a picture of General MacArthur together with Emperor Hirohito. The US felt the need to preserve some of the institutions of Imperial Japan. Instead, rather focusing on some key individuals at the leadership level. Again, the US was explicit about this before. They said they target the guilty leaders of the Japanese people and not the Japanese population as a whole. This can be easily seen. In Japan, only 3% of the population was directly looked at and asked about their personal contribution to the war. Of those 3%, most were military men. In Germany, this number stood at 22%. This is the very same difference as asking every man and woman in Seoul about what he or she contributed to the war, or just asking everyone in Daejeon. In Germany, the US tried to ask every German about their party membership, any stay abroad, their relationship to school, and they even asked which sports organizations they were in. This means that our nuclear survivor Yamaguchi was most likely not asked personally about what contribution he made for the war. And if I'm not bothered personally, then why should I take responsibility for what others did? And it is in this environment that Yamaguchi might have been walking the streets of post-war Tokyo or Nagasaki and seeing this picture. He might have heard newspaper vendors shout and scream, announcing the latest edition about the Tokyo trials. He will read in the newspaper who of the 20-something committed which war crime where. Yamaguchi will read so in the news. But Yamaguchi will not be personally indicted. Those people who committed war crimes in faraway land from homeland Japan will remain equally far to himself. Only something you read in the news, not something that you feel personally. If Yamaguchi would have been in Germany, he might have developed a much more personal understanding, perhaps. The Nuremberg trials were followed by a series of lawsuits that looked into the specific contribution of segments of society. Doctors, lawyers, average soldiers, average police officers. In total, 250,000 people were indicted before court. In Japan, there evolved a difference between the military leaders, them, and those who had to suffer the consequences, me, or me as a victim. This very simplistic way of seeing it was furthered by the US decision to keep the emperor, the one who was formerly head of state, to whom every soldier took his oath. To him, the US assigned the status of a deceived victim. You probably noticed how this word deceived pops up again and again. But it was part of the occupation policy. The Japanese people were deceived. The Japanese soldiers were deceived. And even the Japanese emperor was deceived. So, the average Japanese could easily say that if the emperor is not guilty, then I, who so diligently worked for the emperor, had no decision power whatsoever. I killed no one, I raped no one, I burned nothing, then I am not guilty either. The decision to keep the emperor prevented a symbolic break with the past. And I ask you, why should the Japanese feel that much sorry about their past at that time? You might say, look what they did in Korea, in China, in the Philippines. Yes, the victims will speak. Yes, the Japanese will learn about this. But at that time, what can they see with their own eyes and hear with their own ears? They see destroyed cities and soldiers coming back, remaining silent about their experience for fear of losing face. Just for comparison, instead of watching post-war Japan through Yamaguchi's eye, let's watch post-war Germany through the eyes of my grandparents. Both of them were abroad. My grandfather was a soldier in Eastern Europe. My grandmother, even though a teenage girl, was in what is now the Czech Republic. I put a picture of them here, and I think if my grandmother would see that from heaven, she would yell at me for showing this so publicly. But what they and their generation was able to see when they came back was a little bit different from what the Japanese were able to see. To be sure, cities were in ashes. Food was short, it was cold. Millions were expelled, unsettled, migrating in a search for a place to call home. But still, in Germany, there were not only sites of destruction and victimhood. Hidden behind fences at the outskirts of cities were concentration camps and their evil legacy. Their legacy was concentration camps you could go and visit. The US distributed this flyer. It reads, "This is your responsibility." They distributed it across the country to bring home to the Germans the horrors that were committed in their name. They forced the population of local cities where these camps were to go and see with their own eyes, to smell with their own nose, to feel themselves what was experienced by their neighbors, their friends, their former family members, their brothers and sisters-in-law, to experience themselves what horror was felt by those so violently ripped out of society. Seeing this and realizing what was done in your name and with your modest yet existing contribution and neglect, you only can feel as a perpetrator. You cannot feel as a victim in whatever situation you were. The basic fact that in Japan there are no sites of destruction. Nanking, Manila are in faraway lands inaccessible for the Japanese at that time. Simply because of this geographic dimension, it was not possible for the US to bring home to the Japanese the horrors that were committed in their name. But what did the Japanese see instead? Instead of the symbols of greatest inhumanity, the concentration camps, the Japanese were able to see the sites of the greatest bombs ever dropped in human history in Hiroshima and in Nagasaki. The sites of nuclear destruction at home contrasts with the sites of military aggression abroad. Why the US made a slight difference in occupation policy is another story, but it had an impact. The Japanese felt deceived. Only few leaders were held accountable. The emperor was kept. This story of the average Japanese as a victim finds its material expression in the atomic bomb dome in Hiroshima we see here. There are no sites of aggression the Japanese can visit. I believe this does not mean that the Japanese do not acknowledge their past. After all, war is bad and should be avoided in this narrative because the majority of population will suffer and only a few leaders at the top will get their way. In this sense, the natural answer, and perhaps apology in itself, is peaceful Japan. A civil Japan that tries to rebuild what was destroyed by their leaders, not only in the name of the victims abroad, but also in the name of the victims at home. Therefore, I doubt that the Japanese of my generation, at least most of them, do feel much different than Germans of my generation do. It is just that the sorry is slightly different. In Japan, the sorry is for letting a military leadership ruin East Asia and cause suffering, and the Japanese were passive and blind about this. In Germany, the sorry is for supporting a Nazi leadership that exterminated the Jews and ruined Europe, and the Germans are complicit in this. I cannot make definite judgments about history. I cannot make definite judgments about Emperor Hirohito, who is also called Emperor Showa later on. I cannot make definite judgments about the Holocaust, which coincidentally here is called Shoah in Hebrew language. But I can make definite judgments about how I do see the past. And for this, my grandparents' generation were those who had to apologize. My parents' generation were those who had to reconcile with each other and rebuild bonds. And now my generation has the responsibility to keep this reconciliation and prevent it from happening again. Our generation has the responsibility for a shared future and not for a divided past. Thank you very much.